The idea is that math is really powerful. Hedge funds use a lot of math to make a lot of money. Tech companies use a lot of math to optimize everything. Amazon rose to the top, not because they know books really well, but because they know math really well. Facebook knows math well, so they can build this feed, TikTok. I feel like, and this is not changing with OpenAI and AI coming on the scene. We're at a point in society where math is really, really power. It's been for hundreds of years, but I think it's more than it's ever been because we have so much data, so much compute, and math is the way to harness this. We're in this world where math is power, and is there a way to take that math back, that mathematical power back from the elites?
Welcome to ODSC's AIX podcast, your gateway to the latest in AI and data science. Whether you're an aspiring data scientist or a seasoned AI professional, we bring you insights from the best minds in the field, shaping the future of AI. This episode is sponsored by ODSC West, the premier AI Builders Conference celebrating its 10th year this October 28th to 30th in San Francisco and virtually. Learn more at odsc.com/California and use the code PODCAST for an exclusive 10% discount. Seamus McGovern, the founder of ODSC, will be your host today.
Welcome back to the ODSC AI podcast. Now, today's guest is Noah Giansiracusa, mathematician, professor at Bentley University, and author of Robin Hood Math, Take Control of the Algorithms That Run Your Life. And in this episode, we'll explore how everyday math, yes, even if you're pretty good at it, can help you navigate the hidden systems that shape our world, from college rankings and crime stats to social media feeds and financial fraud. Noah shows how math can empower you to spot manipulation, make smarter decisions, and push back against algorithmic control. Noah, welcome to the podcast. Actually, I should say welcome back to the podcast.
That's right.
So Noah, we were on the podcast last year, but a lot has changed. Please give an introduction to our audience. Tell us what you're working on.
Sure. Thanks for having me back, Seamus. My name is Noah Giansiracusa. I'm a math professor at Bentley University, a business school in the Boston suburbs. We bumped into each other a lot at ODSC, for instance. Last year, you had me on and we talked about fake news, and this goes by different names: misinformation, disinformation, fake news, all these things. But we were really talking about how algorithms and earlier forms of AI are really impacting our information ecosystem. And I would say, to be honest, it's a little bit depressing, right? There's now, I think, like OpenAI recently introduced this Sora social media app that's full of nothing but fake AI videos that look very, very convincing. And, there could be a flood coming up of this stuff.
Sora 2, yeah.
So that's where things were in that conversation, and it's certainly developing. But since that year or so ago when we chatted, I just have really been trying to think carefully, not just what's wrong with the internet, which is a lot of the discourse: monopoly power, advertisement, targeted ads, AI, all the negative things, everything that's going wrong and depressing and tearing us apart. And however you feel about that, I thought we need to figure out those wrongs, but what about figuring out some ways to try to make things better? What can we actually do about these problems that we hear about every single day? And the big picture that came to mind is all the things we're talking about. If you're worried about the internet, AI, disinformation that's powered by algorithms, social media algorithms, whatever your concern is with the internet, it really boils down to algorithms. And algorithms are the way computers codify mathematical concepts and language, right? When I go on TikTok, for instance, and I see a whole bunch of videos, there's some algorithm that's decided what videos I'm going to see, what videos you're going to see, Seamus, when you go online. That algorithm is really just kind of a recipe book filled with mathematical formulas telling the computer how to make these decisions. So then I thought, if so many of our problems in society online are coming down to algorithms, and these algorithms are all written in math, is there some way, since I'm a math professor, is there some way that we can use math to push back and fight against these algorithms and empower ourselves? If they're in a world of math, what if we give ourselves some of that mathematical power too? What will happen? So that's kind of where my head's been, and that's I think will be the basis of this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And listeners to the podcast will know that I use that word fantastic a lot, but I think this is really fantastic because I read a lot of books about AI and tech criticism, and a lot of those books make you angry and depressed. And having wrapped up most of this book, Robin Hood Math, just last night, I found what's different about your book. Pretty much every chapter, I feel I've learned something. I feel empowered. And instead of getting depressed about this stuff, I feel like I can use this in my day-to-day life. I think there's some key takeaways there.
Yeah, that's the goal. It's really exactly, keep using the word empowerment or empowering. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to do. And the name of the book, Robin Hood Math, it's sort of a joke title, but the idea is that math is really powerful. You're in finance. Hedge funds use a lot of math to make a lot of money. Tech companies use a lot of math to optimize everything. Amazon rose to the top, not because they know books really well, but because they know math really well. So they can optimize distribution, logistics, shipments, pricings, everything. Facebook knows math well, so they can build this feed, TikTok. I feel like we're at a point, and this is not changing with OpenAI and AI coming on the scene. We're at a point in society where math is really, really power. It's been for hundreds of years, but I think it's more than it's ever been because we have so much data, so much compute, and math is the way to harness this. We're in this world where math is power. And the half joke, half serious title of the book, Robin Hood Math, is there a way to take that math back, that mathematical power back from the elites, from the quants, the hedge fund managers, from the tech companies? Can we take that mathematical power back and give it to ordinary people? And the funny thing is, Seamus, you work in finance, and yet we were talking a little bit before we started recording that you're finding some of the lessons useful, even if your day job is dealing with numbers and formulas. That doesn't always translate into your day-to-day life. I have the same thing. Like I'm a math
Exactly.
professor. I teach geometry, algebra, data science. Doesn't mean when I walk out across the street that I'm using formulas to make my decisions, but you really can use math in your day-to-day practical life. It just has to be made a lot simpler and more accessible. No one's going to use some huge complicated algorithm or formula to figure out which grocery store to go to or whether to buy fire insurance for your home. We have to make these decisions all the time, and we have some options, right? We could try to use really complicated, sophisticated math, but nobody's going to do that unless you're like an actuary or, professional. Or you could just avoid math and not do it at all and just say, oh, I'm going to make all my decisions in life based on intuition. But what about a middle ground? What if we do learn how to embrace some simple formulas, simple techniques, simple thinking that'll just help us? And I'm not saying to trust math blindly and never use our intuition. I'm saying the kinds of decisions you make in your life about when to change careers, when to maybe do a vaccine or medical procedure that has some potential risks, all these things that involve difficult kind of calculations, we can reinforce your intuition with math. We can use math to draw in some data, some quantitative thinking, some reasoning, so that I think you can make a better decision than you would without the math. So we're not saying don't be human, just be a formula. I'm saying be a human who uses formulas.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Taking mathematic tools from the rich and giving them to everyone else. I think that's brilliant. So, how did you approach making those concepts accessible without dumbing the math down? Because econometrics and others books, they tend to dumb the math down a bit. That
Well,
must be quite tricky.
it started originally what I thought I'd be writing is a book that explains the algorithms that are out there, like social media algorithms, web search algorithms. At the time I was starting
Yeah.
to write, we were just getting the beginnings of generative AI. So I thought, what about just a nice explainer book that kind of helps people understand how these algorithms work? That motivation grew out of is after the fake news book came out that you and I discussed last time, I'd get contacted sometimes by a congressional office or a journalist or someone who just kind of they're dealing with like crafting legislation around social media algorithms or some story about a data leak. And they just found it so hard to know how any of these algorithms work.
Right.
Like they'd hear, I mean, this just came up recently. There was this whole TikTok deal, right? Where China owns TikTok and the US has some law that we're supposed to own our piece of it. And then there's this question of who gets the data, who gets the algorithm. Sure enough, I had journalists calling up and asking, what do they mean by the algorithm? What does the data have to do with the algorithm? And those are at once basic and yet very deep, important questions. And I've had enough conversations to just feel like it's nobody's fault that it's hard to find these things out because I found it hard to figure out what people mean by the algorithm, how these things work. You can get little breadcrumbs. Like if you go on various social media web pages and articles and some investigative reporting, you get little pieces of the puzzle. So I thought, let me just put those pieces of the puzzle together and have an accessible explainer that people can read and they'll understand the broad strokes of how these algorithms work. Not like the level you'd need if you were going to sit down and try to code these things up, but just broad strokes. And that's how it started. But then I started to think, why just algorithms? The algorithms that I was seeing, they kind of reduced to a simple mathematical formula. And I realized there's a lot of places where mathematical formulas are very useful in corporate settings, sometimes in government settings. Simple versions of those formulas can be used in ordinary lives. So the book actually grew out of that. It was just trying to be an explainer of these social media and online internet algorithms. And then it grew to go beyond that. It's not a math book, but it stretched its original scope into mathy territories, not aimed at mathematicians, aimed at ordinary people to get a sense of how math is used. That was the premise.
No, and I think you did an excellent job on that. And going back to social media, speaking of TikTok, I think the sale terms have changed. But at one point, I was reading a story, I was laughing. Someone was going to retain 50% of the algorithm.
That's amazing.
How do you have 50% of the algorithm?
Let me zero in on a really funny thing that came up. So, journalists from NPR called me up and we are trying to talk about this. And his first question is, "What is the algorithm?" And I said, "Well, it's just the math that kind of how they decide what videos you'll see." And he's like, "Well, is it also like the computer code?" I said, "Oh yeah, that could be the algorithm too." "And is it the whole app that you install?" "Yeah, that could be the algorithm." Then we realized the algorithm could be anything. It could be the whole TikTok app or it could be nothing. But the funniest thing is we read a recent executive order describing this TikTok deal. This was just a week or two before our recording time now. One bullet point said the US is going to get its own version of the TikTok algorithm. That'll be our version to own and manage. And we'll just use it on American data. So we'll get an American carved out version of TikTok, separate from China. But then there's a separate bullet item that said there'll be close supervision of any updates to the algorithm. And I thought, wait a minute. If we're the ones running the algorithm, why do we need to supervise the updates? If China's running the algorithm, then so the whole thing was muddled. And it just, I'm laughing, but and you were laughing too at the 50%. But we have to deal with this world where there's these very, very complicated systems that we all interact with. The users interact with them. Politicians have to regulate them. We're all stuck dealing with this complicated setting. And I think the more we can, not dumb down it, but the more we can kind of distill these things to their essence, the better chance we have of talking about them and understanding them.
Your book actually has some of those secret algorithms behind Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. People listening, check out the book because credit to Elon Musk, but people forget this now. He did release the Twitter algorithm a couple of years ago, and Facebook has been kind of leaked over time as well. And as your book went through, it's amazing how similar these algorithms are.
That's what struck, absolutely. It's the similarity. Yeah. Because from the outside, you hear that Facebook was the leader for so many years in social media. Twitter has this very different culture. It's text-based, and TikTok comes along and has this mind-reading algorithm that's so incredible and powerful, and the old guard can't compete. Then when you actually see the math, they all use the exact same formula. It doesn't mean they're identical. One is more video-oriented. The user bases are different. There's certainly differences, but the mathematical core of these algorithms is nearly identical. I did not expect that going in. I was as shocked as anyone.
I was kind of shocked how simple they were. We can talk about weighted average as well. But I also love about your book, you got so many great entertaining anecdotes in there. Like I believe it was a nursing assistant on TikTok. What happened is hilarious. If you can explain that nonsense content.
There are many iterations of this. Just to give your listeners an idea, it was this video where this woman stands up to a mirror, holds this phone up, and there's text overlaid on the bottom that said something like, "Imagine a 26-year-old nursing assistant by your side. Now replace N with S." And it went absolutely viral. All the comments were people trying to explain it. Like, if you just swap the letters, you get this message, and they try to decode it. Or they say, no, it's this deeper philosophical thing. She's saying, imagine reversing the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. People just took it in every direction. And when they had an idea of what it meant, they would try to explain it in comments. And when they didn't get it, they would write in frustration, like, what is this? I forget, BuzzFeed News or someone finally tracked her down and said, you got to tell us. Your video has millions of views at this point. What is the answer to your riddle? What is it? And she said, nothing. It's just nothing. And they're like, what do you mean?
The algorithm.
So she purposely wrote a riddle that doesn't make sense, that's unsolvable, knowing that people would spend time trying to figure it out, claiming they figured it out, arguing with each other, draw a tremendous amount of engagement. Not a lot of happy, positive engagement, a lot of frustrated people, but a lot of engagement. Yeah. And that engagement drives virality. Her video went viral. And I've seen other instances of that where I watch it and think, I know what you're doing here. You'll see a video, like, watch what happens at the end. You watch it 5 times. You don't see anything happen at the end. Then you realize I just got tricked into watching that video 5 times. I just gave it a whole bunch of engagement for free.
Did you ever notice when you go to Boston.com and they say something like the top 100 restaurants in the world just came out, 5 are in the Boston area, and you're like, okay, I got to click on this. Do I really have to click on this? It's almost like the algorithm has spread beyond social media into our everyday lives. Before I leave this topic, what's the single most important thing people should know about gaming their social media feeds? So I don't mean gaming it like the nurse did, gaming it so they don't see that social media slop or AI slop.
Let me cover both sides of the fence. So the people who are just browsing social media, the consumers, and the content creators. If you have a business or you're trying to be an influencer or something. Both of those are important, so let's go through both. If you're just a consumer, someone who uses social media, just browsing, casually, I'd say the main thing is just be very, very, very mindful of your engagement. All engagement shows up in these formulas and is a factor in what gets promoted in your and other feed. All engagement. So if you don't like something, don't write a comment like, this sucks, this is a waste of time. Don't kind of angry repost it and say like, this is so stupid. Or if it's a political thing, it's so tempting to reshare it and say, what an idiot, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Every time you're reposting, resharing, commenting, any form of interaction, even just watching these damn things, counts as engagement, which means it'll increase the probability that you will see more similar content and that other people will see this. So just resist if you can. It's hard, but I find myself sometimes I scroll through and I see a video and some skateboarders at the top of a big ramp and horrible injury coming up, and I kind of want to watch it, but then I think, nope. If I watch one skateboard injury video, I'm going to get 100, and I just try to resist. But it's important.
Your book does have more detailed practical advice on what engagement scores, so you can really game it even more. And I do like that advice, though, because when you're doom scrolling, basically doom scroll faster.
Yeah, content creator side.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science. Seeing these formulas, it's not a groundbreaking thing. We're like, oh, now we can all game the formula. It's more just seeing the basic mechanics laid out helps you, reminds you like, this is the game. This is how it works. It is a game of engagement. That is what matters, and nothing else matters. It's just a clear reminder. If you're a content producer, I think the main thing is you don't want to go down these clickbait paths, right? Of doing the kind of bad stuff that you're describing, but you can kind of cultivate organic community. So my wife was running a flower farm in our backyard for a while, and she had a little Instagram, and she was saying there's some really nice things you can do. Like, you have a flower and you can just post, can anyone identify this? People have lots of fun trying to figure out what kind of flower it is. That's totally harmless. I wouldn't say that that's, clickbait, but people enjoy it, and that produces engagement. So find positive ways to cultivate engagement rather than negative ones. I think that's the key.
I'm loving the positive vibes here. And I do want to dive in more into the math, especially the Bayesian chapter you have. But even before I do that, because again, this is such an entertaining and fun read. And
you hear that? A math book was entertaining and fun.
Yeah, because you used a lot of real world examples, and I'm pretty up in the news, especially when it comes to tech and all that stuff. You use a lot of real world examples. It might have been the scandal at the US News and College rankings, which was pretty shocking. Or of course, SPF, or as people used to name drop him as Sam Bankman-Fried, his rise and fall. Did anything shock you in your research?
Once I had the idea that the book is going to be a bunch of math concepts that can help people better navigate life, I thought, each chapter I'll just find some real world newsy event where this concept came up, exactly as you're describing, Seamus. And then I'll describe what the concept is and how you can use it in your everyday life. What shocked me was that it wasn't actually that hard to find real world instances of these concepts. Sometimes I would find a story, like the Bankman-Fried one. I was just reading a passage from that recent Michael Lewis book about him, and it mentioned expected value. As a mathematician, and I'm sure it's hard for you as a finance person to not leap out of the expected value. He used expected value. So as soon as I read that, I thought, I got to have a chapter on expected value. The news led to the math. But a lot of times I just had the idea of what math I wanted to cover. I thought, this is an important math thing. This could be helpful. And it was very easy to find real world instances where this math came up. What surprised me was how easy it was to connect the math content to the news. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I found that really exciting and kind of optimistic. Like, yeah, look how relevant math is. On the other hand, I felt a little bit depressed. Think of all the poor students that have been taking math classes, finding kind of dry, irrelevant. They get, imagine like I don't know what you learned in Ireland, but the high school geometry here is like triangles, side angle side. It's boring stuff, I'll be honest. And I just think it's not much better.
I didn't learn much better, even worse probably.
And I just think, why? It doesn't have to be that. Some of these concepts, like you mentioned, weighted averages goes into these formulas and things. We could teach students really important concepts and show them how they matter in the world with apps, with things that are happening in the news. So I had a mixed feeling of like, this is great that we can connect the news to math, but also felt a little depressed that so many people are turned off to math and think math is boring and irrelevant and hard and not for them. And I don't think it would take that much to show them a different side of math, but a lot of them, they're already scarred from it.
Yeah, I wonder how many of our listeners who are engineers and have a mathematical background fall into this trap that I find myself falling into. Throughout my career, I've had to work with a quite complex math, and definitely not a math prodigy. I've struggled with most of it.
Believe me too.
Yeah, I struggled with most of it. I've been shocked in my career, especially when I was doing financial consulting and working with some very sophisticated systems, how sometimes they got simplified by some of the formulas you're talking about. I'll give you one example. I can't name names here. And again, it was nothing on my resume because these were all private consulting engagements, but I was working with a financial system where a lot of signals and different data points went into a certain trading algorithm. So say I want to invest in the oil and gas industry and then hedge that with something like durable goods. So when there's a recession, maybe the price of oil will go down, but people still have to pay their bills. If you're a hedge fund, you can hedge one off the other. So we call that market neutral. So if there's a recession, the price of oil goes down, the oil company stocks go down. However, utility stocks may go up because money's shifting out of higher risk into low risk. Winter's coming in New England, we got to pay our bills, right? And then I saw in the middle of this formula that was applying weights to each of the sectors they want to invest in. So they had this great formula using all kinds of real-time analysis to figure out the hedge. And then they just stuck a weight on it. I was like, okay, now where did that weight come from? And I asked them one of the quants, I'm like, where did that weight come from? Oh yeah, we just kind of guessed it. What?
Well, that's a great
So
story.
weighted averages, it's used everywhere.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a great anecdote. I was kind of thinking of saying this, but I shied away from it. But when you asked me, was there anything that surprised me or shocked me in the research for the book? The thing that shocked me the most was almost exactly what you just said. Weighted sums, weighted averages, they show up almost everywhere. Literally almost every chapter in the book, I had some idea of here's the story I want to tell, here's the math concept I want to explore. And it all boiled down to some kind of weighted sum or weighted average almost every time. And I just never really appreciated that. But as I was writing it, I got to see that is how the world tends to work. Let's unpack that because I think I can mention a couple stories from the book and tie it back to what you're mentioning. So you brought up the US News ranking scandal. And for, I guess this is an American-centric story, but there's similar things in the UK and elsewhere. So every year, this magazine puts out this ranking, these very, very widely noted rankings of all institutions of higher education in the US, and they have global versions, et cetera. This thing matters a lot, like where students apply, even like how well alums do on job applications, what kind of money donations these universities are getting. Like it matters a lot. So the universities fight very hard to move up and down even a few positions in the rankings. That makes a big difference for them financially. How do these rankings work? They look at a whole bunch of factors, like graduation rate, maybe like incoming SAT scores, what kinds of loans the students are getting, a whole bunch of different factors. And it's pretty straightforward to rank all your colleges on each of these factors separately. But what if one school's better at first year retention, one's better at graduation overall, one's better at small class sizes, and one's better at tuition? You can have a bunch of schools that are better at some things and worse at others. How do you get one overall global ranking? Say, this is the number one school, this is the number two. The answer is what you found in that financial setting. US News just puts a bunch of weights on different factors. They arbitrarily decide, just like you saw in that financial thing, they'll just say, tuition, let's call that 8% weight. And class size, let's give that 6%. And peer assessment, we'll give that 20%. And they just come up with these numbers. So there's this huge jostling a couple years ago where these schools were going way up and down in the ranking and everyone's trying to figure out what's going on. The schools that went way up said, wow, we really improved. The schools that dropped, what did we mess up? Deans and presidents were fired over this. If your ranking dropped 100 spots in 1 year, that president was out. And it turned out all US News did was adjust the weightings. They raised some weights up and some weights went down. And everyone thought this had so much deeper meaning. And it was just nothing. It was completely arbitrary.
What shocked me was the salary ranking. So the more you pay your staff, the higher the ranking. Like that's crazy.
Supposedly that's a proxy for something else, right? If you're a top faculty, you're going to get lots of offers. Maybe you'll take the highest paying offer. You can imagine how it's a proxy for things, but the rich get richer.
Yeah, I don't know if it was a chapter title or a subtitle, but I really liked the little snappy phrase you had. Bias in, bias out. When I say I was shocked by the weights, I'm not shocked by it per se, but I was like, what biases were included in those weights? So again,
here's where it gets subtle. So there's so many settings where weights come up. So this is a fun connection. You're talking about this financial model, right? Then I brought up the US News, and it's a very similar, mechanics with these weights. We talked about social media earlier, and we didn't go into what this formula is. We kind of alluded to it, but basically what the formula is, it's a weighted sum of the different kinds of engagement. So the idea is when I go on TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the algorithm wants to show me whatever post it thinks I'm most likely to engage with. But does engage mean a like or a comment or a reshare? There's lots of different ways to engage. So they can't kind of deal with all of them at once. You can't compare all of them at once. So what they do is assign weights so they can compare them. So they might say, a like is worth 1 point and a comment's worth 30 points and a share is worth 40 points. Once you give all these different forms of engagement points, then the algorithm can try to guess which posts are going to receive the most engagement points from you. It becomes a one-dimensional thing. You can rank it. So the funny thing is social media ranking engagement, US News ranking colleges, the financial model you just described, They're all the same game where they have a whole bunch of different data sources, and some things do better on some than others. And you want to combine all these different sources into a single number, and putting weights and adding them up is kind of the way to do that.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I love the way we've anecdotes in there. To clarify as well, the book did a great job. Going back to those anecdotes, I could say that the book, you argued that Sam Bankman-Fried, his downfall came from misusing expected value,
Yep.
not from using math. Nick Clegg, who I know because I used to live in the UK and followed UK politics, blamed the users of Facebook for the algorithm's problems.
And there is some truth, right? If I keep watching these
Yeah,
skateboard injury videos and I keep seeing more, isn't that my fault? But that's also like saying I put all the addictive foods, drugs, and
Making
alcohol at
tasty,
the front of the store and saying, oh, it's your fault if you buy all this addictive stuff. So it is our fault, but the whole system was designed to take advantage of our weaknesses. So let's go back to Sam Bankman and the numbers and things. So to me, this was in a way the most interesting thread that wove through the book. Some of the stories are how you can use math to help you. And some of the stories, fewer of them, but some of them, like Bankman-Fried, are how math can lead you astray. And I think that's pretty subtle. Numbers can be your friend, but they can also be your enemy. An example is like the financial model you're describing. If it's very precise and carefully engineered, but some weights are just arbitrarily thrown in there, the output isn't going to be any more careful and precise than the choice of weights, which it sounds like were fairly arbitrary. And the same thing for US News, right? If they're just making up weights and that determines what are the best colleges, then what does it really mean to say you're the best college? Change the weights and you get completely different outputs. I think we do need to be mindful of trusting systems that seem very like magically prescient and precise. Here's this magazine that knows what is the 57th best college in America. It feels meaningful because there's a number. Part of the book, I'm arguing, don't take numbers too seriously. They don't have that level of precision. The world is way too messy. But part of the book is also saying the world is so messy that if you don't use numbers at all, it's very easy to get lost and say things like, I heard of a case of someone having this vaccine and then they had a heart attack, so the vaccine's not safe. Well,
Yeah.
if a million people had that vaccine and only one of them had a adverse side effect, I would say the vaccine is safe. Sometimes numbers are helpful and sometimes they can lead us astray. And it is honestly, I think, a difficult thing to balance, but I think there are some concrete tips that can help you.
No, absolutely. And expected value, as you laid out in your book, is what you can expect on average, right?
On average,
Then,
that's right.
but then you also get into, because I'm a big fan of the Black Swan book. I read that in the middle of the financial crisis. I was on a hedge fund where the sky was falling, reading this book. I'm like, crap, what is it, Six Sigma event or whatever the Goldman Sachs guys call it. So just retracing there, expected value is what you can expect on average, but variance says how likely something is to defy our expectation.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So on average, I might go to a casino and they've messed up the slot machine or let's say the roulette table. They somehow give me this great deal where on average, I'm going to make money whenever I play roulette. That sounds great, right? So put all my money in, keep spinning the wheel as many times as you want because I'm going to keep making money. Well, one of these spins, even if on average I make money, one of these spins I'm going to lose. And if I lose all my money, I'm never going to earn it back. So saying that something is good for you on average is not the same as saying it's always good. Variance is a very helpful concept to measure the range of possible outcomes. And if something can be very good or very bad, that tells you a lot of information that's not just contained in the average.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. Going back to life lessons and using our skills that we learn in our career, taking the finance example as well, because that's one place when it comes to investing. Listeners of the show, there's no advice offered, none given per se. I'm just telling you a little story here. I'm definitely not trying to give you advice, but I've always been very suspect. Let me put it kind of mildly. I've always been very suspect of general financial advice. So I'm sure our listeners have the classical 60-40 portfolio. Of course, that depends on age. It could be 80-20, etc. But diversification is the key of the financial industry. The number one goal in finance is capital preservation. Like, we're not very happy when we lose money because, as Daniel Kahneman and others have said, like, loss aversion is a real thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're happy when we make money, but we're even more unhappy when we lose money.
Yep.
But diversification is very interesting because you covered that a lot, and it's a way in finance to reduce risk here. But myself, I've always found, for better, for worse, sometimes this rule has worked out very well for me. Sometimes it worked out very poorly. And what I do is I ignore that diversification. I try and follow the Warren Buffett style of carefully pick my companies and just go with those. And our listeners can figure it out. But if you had followed the Magnificent Seven stocks for the last 5 years, and or even $1,000, then you're looking at a pretty nice return.
Mhm.
The data bears it out because the S&P 500 pretty much, people are complaining about it for the last 4 or 5 years. It's pretty much all driven by those magnificent seven stocks: Nvidia,
Mhm.
Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft. I'm missing one or two. Maybe Netflix is one of the seven. But anyway, if you just invest in those seven stocks, you're doing so much better than an S&P 500 ETF
Mhm.
because it's the weighted average again, and the lower performers are dragging down the top performers. However, the flip side of that is if we are in an AI bubble or a tech bubble, then you are going to experience even greater losses. So I really think what you talked about, diversification, was spot on.
Let me unpack a little bit. I'm not a finance person, but I wanted to write about finance. I just tried to translate into math language that I thought some people think translate to math will make something harder, but I think it actually made it a little simpler. The whole idea with diversification is it's a mechanism that'll help you aim for the average, right? If I just buy a single stock, that could go up, that could go down,
Right.
that could be very good, that could be very bad, and that's not diversified. But if I bought, basically all the stocks, like a whole Dow Jones Industrial collection of stocks, then some go up, some go down. I get the average of these stocks, and that's a very diversified portfolio. So diversification really is the same thing mathematically as averaging. But what you're kind of highlighting in your story just now is you get to choose what you are averaging. This is important because people hear the word diversify and it just sounds kind of black and white, like, oh, I have a diversified portfolio or I don't. But what you're pointing out is you can diversify in different ways. I really like Google. I'm going to invest in them. But when they first were introducing their AI, it made some mistake and they lost 10% of the company value in a single day. One company could suffer these ups and downs. But you could say, why don't I diversify by averaging across these seven magnificent stocks? That is diversifying, right? It's more averaged than just one, but that's still within this
Exactly.
specific market sector. I could average across the whole S&P 500, which is not all stocks, but it's still, a basket. So it's really helpful to think diversifying. It's a great word. I kind of get what it means, but I think if we try to push more towards thinking of it as averaging, then I think we can get our hands more clearly on what's actually going on. You might want to average across the AI industry. You might want to average across the tech industry because you're worried AI is in a bubble and it might crash. You might want to average some stocks that are tech and non-tech because you think the whole tech industry. So if I just talk about what I'm averaging, I think that's a more refined way of thinking about diversification. It helps you target your diversification or think about targeting it.
Yeah, that's so well put. That makes me think back to chapter 3 again. Oh, was it chapter 5? Sorry, I don't have the book in front of me because
I've probably forgotten myself.
it's another book. But logarithms, right?
Mhm.
We all use them. We learned them in school. And then I'm like, okay, I got to get the log normal of this thing. You generally kind of made it intuitive because I do remember you saying the easiest way to think about logarithms is that it counts the number of digits after the leading digits. So,
Yep.
like 10, 100 and all that stuff. And maybe you can explain that a bit more. But what I loved about that chapter was, and I had read a little bit about this before from David Kahneman and others, but you mentioned how we actually experience money and happiness, right?
Let me unpack that for the
Yeah.
audience. Everyone has seen logarithm at some point in their math education, and it just doesn't make a lick of sense, right? It's just a weird thing. It undoes the exponential, and there's all these bases. But I think the simplest way to think about it, very roughly, as you said, it's counting the digits. So when you tell someone your salary, usually you don't say the number. You say like, oh, it's a six-figure salary, seven-figure salary, five-figure. And that's kind of what the logarithm is doing. It's just telling you the number of digits. It's more refined than that, but that's the basic idea. It turns out that there's a lot of things that our brain processes in a sort of logarithmic way. So light perception, if you to see to keep increasing the amount of light I see, like let's say I'm turning a light on an adjustable dial, if I want it to keep getting like the same amount brighter, I actually have to double the energy going into that light bulb every single time. So I have to increase exponentially the amount of energy to get a constant increase in the amount of light that I perceive. Sound is the same thing. If you've probably heard of the decibel system or the decibels of a motorcycle revving or a gunshot. This is also a logarithmic scale because the energy that goes into these sounds increases exponentially in a way that our brain perceives as linear. Our brain is somehow automatically applying a logarithm. Kahneman and some collaborators have found that our brain seems to experience money in a logarithmic way. That one way to think about that is exactly as you said. So I talked about Warren Buffett as an example. He must have been so happy the moment he became a millionaire, right? That was a big deal in his life. But then going from a 1 millionaire to a 2 millionaire probably wasn't such a big deal. Or even more, like when he went from 6 million net worth to 7 million net worth, what does that really mean? But going from a millionaire up to 10 million and 10 to 100, 100 to a billion. These are kind of like the evenly spaced milestones in his career. What that means is that there's this logarithmic tendency in the way we perceive and interact with money. The practical takeaway is be very careful. If you think about a straight line going up, if you think that's how money is going to impact your happiness, like, I'm going to keep getting more money and I'm going to keep getting happier, the logarithm bends way down. So yes, you will get happier as you get more money, but not nearly as fast as you think you will. You'd actually have to keep getting more and more money at an exponential rate, which is very, very hard to keep getting that constant increase.
I'm happy to be a subject for that experiment. So if people want to send me money, I'll build a little website with a happiness meter.
You'll measure it and report back and we'll see. Sounds good. Sign me up for that too.
I liked your take on reasoning because as data scientists, and for some people, Bayesian math is the be all and end all. And I'm very fond of that formula myself, but I can't say I use it like that because, and again, I think you explained it more clearly to me because having read books from David Kahneman, like Thinking Fast and Slow and understanding my biases, right? Understanding what biases I'm making around money and other decisions. You talk about this subjective probability, and that's based on the strength of my beliefs on unique events, right? So you mentioned buying fire insurance. What's my belief in that? How much coverage do I need? So your treatment there, Bayesian reasoning, I thought was really insightful because, again, you made a distinction between two kinds of probability: the frequentist probability, flipping a coin, and then the subjective probability. And I'm like, okay, wait, I really should start thinking in terms of which kind of probability am I doing here? I'm doing frequentist, and sometimes I'm doing subjective.
That's right. And I think that's almost the biggest point. Bayes formula is great. You can use it in data science. You can use it in your real life. Plenty of people love it, especially our audience on this podcast. But I think what you were just hitting on is almost the bigger point. Even though it's the more elementary one, it's really important. I follow a lot of AI news and there's a lot of discussion. One of the New York Times bestselling books the last couple of weeks is Giansiracusa has this book titled something like, If They Build It, We All Die. Yeah. An argument for how AGI is going to wipe out all of humanity. And you hear about every AI expert has their probability of doom, P doom 30%, P doom 80%. And it's kind of absurd, right? It's like, what's the probability that a Martian's going to land on Earth and kill everyone? Oh, I think it's 15%. Do you think it's 18%? It's just numbers completely made up. On the other hand, there are settings like insurance. You mentioned like a house fire. The insurer might say like, oh, where you live, based on your house, the building materials, there's a 7% chance of a devastating house fire. Are they just making up that 7%? It's not in the same way, right? They probably have a lot of data where they can look at comparable houses and see what happened and extrapolate. So you just have probabilities thrown around in very different ways. Ones that have a lot of data backing them up and ones that are expressing intuition. And they both have value and meaning, but they're very different. So that is kind of one thing I want to emphasize in the chapter is you can use them both. But as you said yourself, let's just all try to be a little more clear with ourselves and with others which one we're talking about. If the forecast has a 15% chance of rain, I kind of get a sense of what that means. If I say there's a 20% chance that I'm going to adopt a dog today, it doesn't mean there's 5 of me running around the universe and one of them's going to get a dog. It means that's measuring how strongly I feel like I'm actually going to find myself there. So one is subjective and one is more frequentist or empirical. They're both valid. The subjective one, so I'm kind of laughing at the 70% chance an alien lands in Nebraska. The reason why that's helpful is there's these interesting studies of asking people, if you had to decipher what people mean by phrases like likely, very likely, unlikely, if you ask people to put numbers to these things, you get wildly different numbers. So why do we go around using English words that nobody knows what they mean? What does very likely mean? More than 50, more than 90, 70? Nobody knows. It means so many things. So why use those words when I can just say, there's an 80% chance that I want to watch this movie tonight? In that case, I would say the numbers help us talk more clearly and precisely. But the problem is once we start doing that, it's easy to mistake those numbers that are just a language with no data behind them with the numbers of like, there's a 5% chance that I'll get mugged if I walk in some neighborhood of New York, because historically that has been the rate. That's what the data say. Some numbers have data behind them, some don't. They both have value. They both can be helpful, but it's very easy to conflate them if we're not careful.
No, absolutely. And to our listeners who are not familiar with Bayesian stats, when you read Noah's book, this will really open your eyes to a lot of things. Bayesian stats is so anchored around prior beliefs, right? Mm-hmm. I recall in your book, you mentioned a very important point that our prior beliefs are updated, not replaced.
Yep, exactly.
It was very interesting. And because, like using this stuff in machine learning and choosing those priors, I always thought was really, really important. And again, bias in, bias out.
Yep.
But you're actually saying it's central to how reasoning works.
Yeah, anytime you read the news, if you know a friend or family member who has a very different political outlook, read a news event, even the same story as your friend or family member, and you're going to see it in such a different way. Even if you're literally, this is not like a filter bubble, oh, they're on Fox News and I'm on New York Times. Like these same story,
Yeah.
watch the same TikTok video, whatever you want, you will see different things and interpret different ways than they will. That's because we're not starting with a clean slate, as you said, and just, oh, now I'm informed on this event that just happened. We have a Bayesian prior on how the world works, what I think of the president, of the country, the economy, the geopolitics, everything. We have priors on all of that. It's difficult to articulate them with numbers, but we have some kind of priors. And the news event is going to update our priors. So my priors are very different than my cousin's priors. When we see the news, we're going to see very different things because of those priors. But I think it's just helpful to realize, yes, this is a formula, as you said, that is gospel to many data scientists, but I think it also helps us understand our own brains, that we all have these kind of Bayesian machines in our head that never start clean. They always bring in priors, and those priors are a form of bias. Bias isn't always bad. It just means you've broken the symmetry somehow. So we come to everything we encounter with this priors, and we filter the new knowledge through that lens. That's what Bayes' formula does. That's what our brains do. And I think it's just really helpful to recognize that.
Yeah, that was a bit of a hot take from the book for me. Brains are Bayesian machines.
I mean, we don't know that for sure, but it sure seems like that to some extent.
Yeah, there are times when our brains seem like the Bayesian machines. I would say my brain is mostly a hot mess of too many thoughts at once. It's not really a Bayesian machine. I wish it was. But again, I would stress to our listeners, like whether you read the book or not, just take this into account because look what's happening in our daily lives. My prior experience with, black swan events and my training is like always expect the unexpected. I don't walk around with a cloud hanging over myself. Once you're kind of prepared for the worst, it sometimes helps you deal with that because I had a bit of a health scare last year. And it was a scare because there was nothing really wrong with me. But when you go to a doctor, especially in the US, they have to tell you all possible outcomes. And then they give you a number like, well, there's an X%. It could be this. So I basically got a little flustered, didn't really talk to anybody about it. And I'm like, I'm going to go home now. And I'm kind of going to go and try and figure out, like, what does this mean for me?
Yes, exactly.
Look at my age, my health, what I do, stuff like that. So, that's certainties versus probabilities and trying to do some Bayes thinking there.
Yeah, and just to kind of elaborate for the listeners, kind of what you're getting at is when those doctors tell you you have a 1% chance of this rare deadly disease or something, that's really scary, like 1 in 100. But that's a frequentist thing. This is just the raw chance of this happening based on some random uniform population. That's not you. It's much better to think of these medical things from the Bayesian perspective, which is to say, before you had that test or doctor's appointment, you had probably a very, very low chance of this rare thing. And now, yes, you had this test result or symptom that increases your chance. But if your chance was extremely rare, like 1 in a million, and it's now 10 times more likely, if a doctor said, you're 10 times more likely to have this deadly thing, you'd be terrified. But if they said your chance went from 1 in a million to 1 in 100,000, you'd be like, oh, so it went from rare to rare. So it's just to say, when rare things increase their likelihood, they're still rare. And a lot of medical diagnostics is that way. Doesn't mean you should never worry and don't go to the doctor and don't follow up. But the numbers you hear are not given in a Bayesian perspective of how does this impact my odds. They're given in a more frequentist way that may not be as relevant for you as the individual.
No, absolutely spot on. Let's talk about some fun topics, Sam. You did an interesting chapter. Why play if you lose? I played the lottery now and again, scratch ticket. I definitely go to the casino. I like to make the odd bet. Do I think I'm smarter than the average person? Probably a little bit. So let's talk about that. Games of chance, casinos, insurance companies. Why play if you lose?
Playing poker with your friends, being smarter than them matters, right? If you're going to the casino, you're not trying to be smarter than the other people there. You have to be smarter than the house.
Can I tell a quick note about playing poker?
Not a poker person, but I appreciate it in the abstract.
So I used to go to poker night every Sunday night. And I was pretty good at it. I studied all the rules, studied strategies. You can do a little basic card counting. It's not that hard.
It's a very mathy, data-driven.
Yeah. And then my boss is like, you're coming in tired every Monday morning. What's going on? I'm like, okay. So instead of playing until 1 2 o'clock in the morning, I have a rule. I would have to be out of there by midnight. right? At least by midnight. So get home, get
Yeah.
a good night's sleep. And I started to lose a lot. I never told the people I was playing with anything about this. I'm just like, oh yeah, okay, I'm out. Because in poker, you can get out time. So I just dropped out altogether because I was losing all the time and I couldn't do it. And I remember asking them about 4 or 5 months later, were you guys cheating on me? Were you ganging up? He's like, no, Seamus, we knew when you come in around 8 o'clock, you had to be up by 12. So we just bide our time.
Oh,
And your,
interesting.
your play would start to change because you would start to play a little more reckless.
Amazing.
And we knew you had to be out by midnight. So anyway, there's all kinds of strategies in poker, but I interrupted. My apologies.
Oh, I heard this amazing thing that apparently some strategies in poker involve choosing a random number and you want as uniform a random number as possible. But we know that it's very difficult for the human to come up with random numbers. If I say come with a random number between 1 and 10, you're going to say 7. Maybe you'll say 3. So we're not good at
7
that.
or 3. Like 7 and 3 are the most, 7 and 3 are the most popular random numbers or something like that. Yeah.
In fact, someone was playing with ChatGPT early on. I don't know if it still works this way. They asked it to come up with random numbers and it came up with 7 and 3 way more often than the others because that's in the training data. Anyway, so apparently some poker players will wear a analog watch and like they'll kind of use the orientation of the hand around the watch as a pseudo random number generator. Actually, is this Liv Borey is this, she's a professional poker player who's very into using numbers and math in her day-to-day life. She's one of the people I described a little bit in this Bayesian chapter because I just thought it's so interesting how she's using these formulas. In a podcast interview, she said, knowing about this random number generator thing with the wristwatches, she found that anytime she sat down at a poker table and one of the players had an analog watch, she would get intimidated just at the sight of the analog watch because she'd think, oh no, this person's running one of these algorithms with a random number generator. They're pretty good. Just like get intimidated, layers and layers. But your friends, knowing about your midnight deadline, that's a great example. So let me just end with a fun little vignette that kind of answers your question of why play games. The context is we talked about expected value. What do you expect on average? There's a lot of games where the expected value is negative. Lotteries are such an example. Casino games are an example. If I played poker with my friends, I'd have an expected negative verdict. So there's a lot of things where we know we're going to lose some money. So why do we do it? And, the simple answer you could say is, oh, there's a chance you could win or the variability is still exciting. But I think one way to think about it is expected value is only measuring one specific kind of value, the thing that it's designed and aimed at measuring. So if I'm talking about playing roulette, I can compute the expected value of various wagers and configurations, and it's just measuring literally the financial return. But it's not measuring, maybe I went to the casino with some friends and we had fun, we had a couple drinks. My total value on getting out of the experience, it's just measuring that roulette value. So the funny anecdote, and I have this in the book, it's been fun to share for many years. When I was a little kid, I visited my uncle. He was a statistics professor. My parents hate the lottery because they view it as a negative expected value competition. You're guaranteed to lose money on average, so why play? And here's my uncle, literally a professional statistician, and the afternoon comes and he says, oh, I'm going to go get the daily lotto tickets. My parents said, why would you get lottery tickets? It's a loss, and you're a statistician, you should understand. And he says, don't worry about it, I'll get you tickets too. And my parents said, don't get us tickets, that's a total waste. So he goes out, and while he's at the store, my parents start thinking, what an idiot. Who's ever heard of a statistician who plays the lottery? He knows what a waste this is. And then they start saying, if we did win, think of all the things we could do. We'd travel, fix up the house. We could visit this relative we haven't seen for... And they spent 2 hours just living in fantasy land of what they're going to do with their jackpot. Lotto drawing comes along. Of course, no one in the family wins a single penny. We all lose. And my parents confidently say, see, we told you it's a waste. You wasted your $2 on their ticket. And my uncle says to them, I spent $2 to give you a whole afternoon of dreams. Where else could you get that for $2? And they said, you know what? And it's true. This is an example. Remember, I was talking about the thread of how much to lean on math and not to. This is an example. Math can help you, right? If you go to the casino thinking you're going to make money, the math can help you realize you're not, or figure out how to do it, or help you strategize. Be realistic. But math can also train you to only notice certain quantifiable things and miss everything else in life. So I think it is important to recognize there's so much more in life than just numbers. Don't limit yourself to numbers.
Yeah, and your anecdote around Sam Bankman-Fried is true to that as well, because I find myself doing that sometimes when I am using math to calculate something, but someone else is going to get a little upset with me based on my logic and reasoning, and it's not worth it.
Yeah.
So I change my calculation. I'm like, okay, it's not worth it.
Yeah, you have to decide how much to lean into it and when to override it. Maybe the math says to do something.
Life is not a formula at times, but As always, this has been so much fun. I
Oh,
really
me too. Enjoyed it.
Thank you so much again. How can people follow your work? Where's your preferred place for people to go grab this book?
You know what? I've meandered between different social media platforms. Lately, I've been on LinkedIn mostly, so you can find me there. If you have show notes, I can put a link to the book and all that in my webpage.
Yes, if you can email me that link and I'll include that in the show notes.
Perfect.
We'll have you on the show again. This has really been
Sound
fantastic.
great. And hopefully I'll see everyone at the Open Data Science Conference again.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks.
Your engagement directly contributes to the growth and success of our community. Please subscribe now and don't miss out on the next enlightening episode. This episode is sponsored by ODSU AI West, the premier AI Builders Conference celebrating its 10th year this October 28th to 30th in San Francisco and virtually. Learn more at ODSU AI and use the code PODCAST for an exclusive 10% discount. Supporting our podcast by subscribing not only helps our small dedicated team at ODSE, but also unlocks exclusive benefits for you.